Awesome. Yeah, so today I'm here to talk to you about Happy City's ongoing work in the housing realm, specifically our work thinking about designing for social connection and well-being in multi-unit housing. So I wanted to start with a little story of a project that we've been involved with for several years in Vancouver. And this is the building. So it's located near Main Street in Vancouver, for those of you who are in Vancouver or have been there. And it's a very special building. So it's got a long story of how it actually came to be. One of the things that's really interesting about this project is that it's it's an innovative sort of petri dish for all kinds of experiments. So in some ways, it's a social experiment. There's lots of building kind of innovative things that are also happening in it. And that is kind of reflected in the amount of time and kind of effort that it took to build. But it is a really wonderful place, and we've had the privilege to study it for several years. So it's called our Urban Village Co-housing, and it's a 12 unit building. So it's kind of a missing middle infill project. It replaced a former duplex in this neighborhood in Vancouver, which is largely single family homes. And the idea is with a co-housing group, a group of families, so in this case, 12 families, agrees to come live together with the idea that they want to share more common spaces. They want to, support each other in different ways. So this building has residents from uh, aged, I think 2 is the youngest, all the way to someone in her 80s. And it's really cool to see kind of the intergenerational relationships that have formed since they've moved in. And the reason we call it co-housing light is unlike traditional co-housing, which usually residents are actually their own developer, it's actually a new kind of model and the first in North America where we tested what happens when a co-housing group actually partners with a developer who takes on kind of more of the traditional developer role. But throughout the development process, the families are getting to know each other and kind of deciding how they want to live together intentionally. So I encourage you to check out this project on our website. We did a very detailed research study funded by CMHC. So we did kind of interviews and surveys with residents before and after they moved in at different points to understand kind of how this building impacted their well-being. And the results were really quite fascinating. So we kind of surveyed people before they moved in. We found that on average, they were about as lonely and connected as the average person in Vancouver. But afterwards, basically no one in the building reported ever feeling lonely. So it really has, become this idea that our building and the way we live can actually be a cure for this loneliness and social isolation epidemic that we're facing across Canada. And what we're really talking about and what is happening at our urban village is this idea of intentional community. So we see all of these stories of people interdepending and interrelying on each other for things like everyday tasks, getting groceries, sharing Costco runs, watching someone's kid for 5 minutes or a day, or feeding someone's pet over the weekend, sharing tools and resources. They have one ladder, one lawnmower. They have a buy nothing group, so they'll say, "Hey, who has a tennis ball?" or "Who has a can of beans?" And those small things actually are making a huge social difference for people's well-being. And we all have very busy lives, so when we have these social connections built into our day-to-day, they become normal, and they really actually start to transform both of our kind of social connections, our mental health, and our physical health. And that's kind of the question that we are posing to developers and architects and policymakers and funders and public health authorities is, we are in the midst of a housing crisis. We do need more housing across Canada, but there is also this idea that our homes can do more for us. They can be catalysts for social connection, and they can help us live in a way that is really supportive for our mental and physical health. So we say that, these, when we kind of study communities where people are socially connecting with their neighbors, we see all of these kind of positive ripple effects across society, all the way to, better participation in democracy, better preparedness in an emergency. And as we're facing climate change, we know that more and more climate disasters are coming our way as well. So first of all, I just wanted to go over kind of how we understand and talk about social well-being. So the Happy Cities was actually founded based on the book Happy City, which was written by Charles Montgomery over a decade ago. And really, the premise of this book is the idea that the way we design our cities can really make or break our well-being. And we talk about health in different ways, but we know that the environment we live in is really critical for our health and our well-being. And as I said kind of in the intro, we're facing growing challenges as a society, acute housing affordability crisis, extreme weather, social isolation, and aging population in Canada. And we know that our social connections are one of the strongest resources we have to chart this way forward and kind of multi-solve for all of these issues together. And it's definitely not easy, but what we try to do in all of our work is bring these different perspectives and ideas together to say, how can we do this differently? And if we can do this differently, how can it impact people's lives in a positive way? So I just put this quote up from Dr. Julian Holt-Lunstad. I'm sure many of you have seen this if you follow kind of the research around social connection. But being socially connected in meaningful ways is actually key to human health and survival. And this is kind of obvious, but we kind of forget it sometimes. We know that chronic loneliness and social isolation can be as damaging to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day and increases the risk of premature death by as much as 50%. And on the flip side, we know that strong social supports are protective for our physical and mental health and our cognitive decline. And we know that strong relationships are really protective for us. So these numbers are kind of the latest from the 2021 Canadian Social Survey. 3 in 10 are reporting feeling sometimes lonely, and 1 in 10 are feeling often lonely. And we're seeing these numbers rise across demographics, including young people and older adults. And if you want to dive more into kind of the research, I encourage you to check out Hey Neighbour Collective, who is one of our key partners. And they've done a really excellent evidence backgrounder around some of these tidbits of evidence that I've pulled onto the slide. So higher levels of happiness, well-being, and life satisfaction when you know your neighbors. Children are twice as likely to engage in daily outdoor play. Youth report better sense of well-being and sense of safety. We're more likely to give and accept help in a crisis. We're more likely to volunteer, vote, and engage. So those kind of wider democracy benefits. And older adults report decreased loneliness, increased self-reported health. So as I mentioned, we're a kind of planning and research firm based in Vancouver and Halifax. We're pretty small, but mighty team, so we do a lot of different work. We do planning and design, research and policy, and education. So a lot of talks and conferences to kind of share the work that we've been doing. And my work specifically focuses on housing. So through housing, we do kind of a bunch of different things. We do planning and design at the master plan stage. We do design audits where we actually work with developers and architects to understand how their design might impact social connection and how they could improve it. We also do on that stream policy and design guidelines. So we recently got a set of guidelines approved for the city of Port Moody in BC. And it's a pretty unique policy that's looking at an incentive-based approach to getting developers to provide more social spaces in buildings. So also encourage you to check that out on our website. And through kind of all this work, we do a lot of engagement with everyone from residents of buildings to developers to architects, funders. So looking across the housing system. And on our kind of research, one of our key pieces of work that we like to do is these post-occupancy evaluations. So this is, again, our urban village. We did a very detailed study of that. We also did a detailed study with post-occupancy studies of buildings operated in Vancouver that are serving seniors. So that's also on our website. And This is just our original housing work at the Happy Homes Toolkit, which we released in 2017. So this has really been the launching pad for everything that I've been doing for the last 5 years or so. And again, remembering we do talk a lot about design, but we also do work around programming. So again, our partners at Hey Neighbour Collective are really focused on this programming piece and the policy. And we know that all of these different aspects have to align in order to make sure that social connection is really happening in our buildings. So we see a lot of buildings with great amenity spaces, but without the right kind of operational policies and programming, they don't necessarily encourage social connections in the way that we think they might. And kind of at the core of all of this conversation is without affordable housing choices that provide secure tenure, it's really hard to build on these well-being goals. So when our core housing needs are not met, it's really hard to talk about joy and sociability, belonging and meaning. And it's really hard for people to build kind of meaningful, thriving lives. So some of the emerging research and topics from our work. These are here the reports I've mentioned. Please log on to our website and read some of them. We intentionally publish all of our research. We want it to be read and seen and used by people. So you'll see up there the building social connections. We did some work with the city of North Van, some post-occupancy studies, age-friendly, where we audited 20 buildings in Vancouver, Port Moody social wellbeing design guidelines, and we do work in other areas too. For example, we've released a dementia-inclusive planning and design guideline as well recently. So to explain about how we think about social interaction in neighborhoods and in buildings, we really think about social interaction as a spectrum. So you will experience this in your day-to-day life. You'll have, spontaneous encounters. So you might say hi to someone while you're walking your dog, or say hi to someone at the mailbox. What we say is the way we actually design buildings and neighborhoods can enable those kinds of encounters. So for example, on the flip side, if you live in a tower and you park your car and you go straight up the elevator and to your unit, you're not very likely to meet your neighbors. And if you never meet your neighbors, you probably won't know them. And that is the case for many people who live in high-rise buildings if they don't have other opportunities to connect. So we think about what are the natural places where we can slow people down, make spaces comfortable to kind of linger. So maybe it's a really nicely designed lobby that has a social space beside it, or a nice community garden at the front of your building. These are kind of these spaces that provide these opportunities to actually encounter your neighbors. And over time, if you spend time in these spaces, you'll start to recognize people and say, hey, I know your dog's name. What's your name? And maybe after 5 or 10 times, you actually start to know each other. And this is where we think about beyond design, we can think about programming. So things like a community garden, which is like an opportunity to actually work with people that you're starting to know and build those meaningful relationships. And what we see in a building that I showed you earlier, our urban village co-housing, they're really working hand in hand to kind of manage their building. They're also doing weekly meals. So 3 times a week, they all have dinner together. They take turns cooking. And those are really like the ways that they are building these relationships over time. And that's how they kind of end up at this far end of the spectrum where you have mutual support, where people are actually really helping each other out. If a neighbor is sick, they're looking out for them, they're checking in on them, they're helping each other take care of their kids and their pets. And at our urban village, they also share private cars. So they're saving money, having these social connections, and really building that support network for each other. The other really important concept to think about when we talk about socializing in between neighbors is this concept of social group size. And you might have heard of kind of Dunbar's numbers. So he was like a researcher who first kind of came up with this idea that we have a certain number of people that we can know really well. and a certain number of people that we can actually recognize. So we think really carefully about these social group sizes and kind of privacy and exposure to privacy because we know we like to connect, but we don't want to feel forced to connect, and we don't want to connect all the time. So it's thinking about the balance of how people are interacting. And often what we see in buildings is we have these really large scale gathering spaces, but the kind of smaller ones are missing from the fabric. Um, so some of the stats that are emerging from our research, we did a big survey with the city of North Vancouver in 2023. And we also did a Metro Vancouver-wide survey also in 2023 called My Neighborhood, My Home, My Neighborhood. And we asked people, how often they feel lonely. So we found similar numbers to kind of the Canadian surveys. But really to highlight that 17 to 25% of people are reporting feeling often or always lonely. Similarly, we asked people, are you familiar with any of your neighbors? And good news is about 80% of people do know a few neighbors. The kind of average is 1 to 3. Fewer, smaller number who know like 7 or more, for example. But we do have this like proportion of people, 12 to 90%, who report not knowing any of their neighbors. That's a pretty significant proportion of our population. We also found some stats through our research, the My Home, My Neighborhood study, which is also on our website, where we looked at the ways which density and housing forms actually impact well-being. So interestingly, we found that people are happy and healthy at different densities. So some people, like living in a single family neighborhood. Some people like living in Yaletown or a really densely populated downtown. But what really matters is kind of the quality and the types of things that you actually have at your disposal. We also found other measures. For example, we know that having a long commute time is generally bad for your health because you have less time and energy to do things that you love. And generally in our research, we haven't been finding that living in a tall building means that you're going to be isolated and have bad health. But the way we design these really tall and dense areas is really, really important. So another thing that we've been really trying to understand is like where and how people actually interact with their neighbors in buildings. So interestingly, these kind of spaces that we don't think of right away when we think, okay, what are the social spaces in a building? We'll probably think of like the lounge or the indoor amenity space, but actually people are connecting in these types of stitching areas like lobbies, corridors, elevators, that zone right outside the building, really important for social connection. Outdoor spaces, also important, and places like parkades, bike storage, garbage rooms. These are places where people are actually connecting. So this is what I'm talking about of like, where are the opportunities to actually slow people down, get them connected, making them feel comfortable in these spaces without adding a ton of need for, extra expenses or extra area in our buildings. And we also know from our work that access to multiple social spaces is associated with a higher likeliness of knowing your neighbors, better overall social connections, a greater willingness to ask neighbors for help, and reporting feeling less lonely. So these things all kind of make sense. If you actually have spaces to get to know your neighbors, this will positively impact your social life. And we also this is from the North Vancouver study. So we also asked kind of what kind of spaces people actually use daily or weekly. So unsurprisingly, these kind of like very practical spaces like the gym, the laundry, are kind of important for connecting. Outdoor spaces are really important, especially in Vancouver. And we can think about these spaces in different ways. So there are really great examples of laundry rooms that are super social. Like, what if you put your laundry room next to a courtyard and you have kids playing outside while the adults are doing laundry, or you can just go sit and read a book in the courtyard while you're there. And that again is like slowing people down and increasing the number of social opportunities. And again, I kind of mentioned this concept, but balancing privacy and kind of choice is really important. So you'll see kind of this diagram of a courtyard is showing kind of the transition from public to semi-public to semi-private to this building. So really thinking about how these different transitions between space are happening. And if people feel like they're very overcrowded and they don't have a good transition between these, a lot of people respond by retreating. So the way that we actually design social connection is really subtle in the details of how the spaces actually get used. Okay, and then bringing us to the Building Social Connections Toolkit. So this project has been many years in the making. Our key partner is Neighbour Collective, and we've also been working with different groups at SFU, so SFU Renewable Cities, which is working with us on the latest phase, and SFU Gerontology that has been working with us on past research phases. So in phase one, which was 2023, we worked with the city of North Vancouver, and I shared a lot of those stats from the study there. We were trying to evaluate the impacts of a specific policy that they had around social connection. Also in 2023-2024, we worked with 6 local governments in the Lower Mainland of BC to actually come together through 4 in-person workshops and really talk about what this all means in terms of policy and what we're actually seeing being built in the Lower Mainland. And all of that kind of research work led to the Building Social Connections Toolkit, which we launched last summer. And we were lucky enough to get another round of funding from CMHC this year. So starting in a couple of weeks, we are doing a series of educational sessions for planners nationally. And there'll be 3 sessions. So we're calling it Building Social Connections in Practice. And so far we have 125 planners from across Canada from 45 municipalities represented. And the idea is really that it is a learning cohort like we did for the 6 local governments here to bring together all of these like pretty complex research topics and understand how that might translate into municipal policy. So our Building Social Connections Toolbox, again, recommend you check it out. It's actually a pretty fun document to read through. There's lots of images, illustrations. So we tried to make it really user-friendly. And this is really designed for anyone who's interested in, how the built environment and especially housing impacts our social connection. So we've got planners, planning consultants, architects and designers, market and non-market housing developers, all levels of government, and individual residents and community advocates. And all of these stakeholders also kind of helped us inform what we put into the toolkit. So the toolkit is kind of separated into 4 areas. We have those social building edges, which I talked about, which are really important. Our social circulation spaces, which includes our lobbies, our corridors, our social nooks and our stairs, our social amenities, which are the traditional amenities that we think about, like lounges, courtyards, bicycle spaces, and then thinking about homes in terms of how we transition from public to private. And you'll see in the toolkit that we have these kinds of 6 principles that kept coming up in conversation. So we kind of put them together as the guiding principles for the toolkit as a way to help planners and architects think about design in a different way. So rather than saying, we need to have 100 square feet of amenity space in this building, which is usually how we regulate it. Okay, why do we need 100 square feet of amenity space? And what is the quality of that space? What is it actually going to do for people to provide social value? So we really encourage people to think about these 6 principles: location, invitation, activation, inclusion, transition, and evolution. And I'll give you some examples of each one. So location is really about thinking, if we have a limited budget and limited space in our building, which we all do, where are we maximizing those opportunities? So where are those nodes where we could potentially put something that would help people slow down and help them interact with neighbors? So things like natural light. That makes us more comfortable to stay in a space. And then thinking about co-locating elements. So if you have a little dog bowl station next to a community garden, then suddenly you have different people interacting and talking. So we see this a lot in courtyard buildings when you have really thoughtful placement of amenities. So you'll have these indoor-outdoor connections that can start forming in that particular building. You see all of these great kind of visual connections and transitions between the building. We also see this really well in mixed-use communities where they're kind of integrating public spaces into the building and bringing services to the neighborhood and kind of value to the neighborhood through the new density. Invitation is really about maximizing those spontaneous daily encounters, using the built environment as kind of an invitation and an icebreaker for social interaction. So we often hear things like community gardens or kids or pets are just an invitation to talk to someone. You know, it's, if someone has a dog, it's okay to talk to them, but if they don't, it's not. So there's these like subtle social cues that we can kind of replicate through the built environment to make us feel invited to connect. So you'll see this building by David Baker Architects. They've done a really fabulous job with the front of the building. They've got this really great spot to pause and interact with this indoor-outdoor seating, a really distinct visible entrance, so super accessible. They've got all these kind of lighting and placemaking features. And even if, you know, that day you don't feel like interacting with your neighbors, just kind of walking by that social interaction is actually also beneficial from our health. So this, you know, is a really inviting way to make a building more sociable. Activation. So this is really about giving people a reason for actually visiting these spaces. So we see a lot of amenity spaces that go underused, really because there is no great reason for someone to visit it. So this is another David Baker Architect building. It's a affordable family housing. And they've done just a really nice job with the courtyard. So they have these visual connections to the courtyard between the balconies and the public space. They've got that direct access to the laundry room that I mentioned earlier. These indoor-outdoor connections again, an informal play area with public art, and these community gardens. So there's a lot of reasons why you would want to spend time in the space, and it feels really comfortable. And on that note, inclusion. So really encouraging people to think about how does this space feel for people who have different abilities or ages or backgrounds or preferences than you. It's always like putting ourselves in other people's shoes to say, you know, how would this type of person feel here? Or and this is where the kind of post-occupancy study and kind of engagement is so important because each time we have a new conversation, we learn something about how spaces make people feel and how they kind of impact their behavior. So you'll see this wonderful lobby space, and you'll see the corridors are quite wide. So this is a seniors building. They've brought natural light into the corridors to make people more comfortable. You know, if you're someone with a mobility device or you just need to take your time walking down the corridor, it's very comfortable. You've got handrails. And then you've got this really nice space to just sit and read a newspaper. You've got a community notice board, some resident artwork, really nice lighting. So overall, this space feels really comfortable to kind of pause and linger. Transition. So I know I talked about this one. We're really thinking about how we balance public and private spaces together, especially in dense environments. So thinking about things like active stoops, where you have a place to pause before you go out and interact with the public. And then thinking about really livable indoor spaces where you feel like that space is really comfortable for you when you close your front door, you're not hearing your neighbors through the walls or hearing people yelling in the courtyard. Thinking about acoustics is really important. And those things can really corrode relationships between neighbors. And finally, evolution. So this one is really about nurturing a sense of belonging through stewardship of common spaces and allowing spaces to evolve with residents. This is something that we see done really well in co-housing communities like our urban village. This is another co-housing community we studied, which is in North Vancouver called Driftwood Village. And it's also a really wonderful community. But they use their spaces really intentionally. So right now they have a really big cohort of small kids under 5. So they use the space to actually just create a kids activity room. And it's a great place to just let your kids run wild, especially on rainy days. Um, and the other space that they really wanted to create was a workshop to share tools. So they also prioritize that. But they're constantly kind of reinventing how they're using their spaces. And they're doing that because of the kind of structure of the co-housing group that allows them to discuss and kind of share and make decisions about their spaces. Um, so I promise I'm almost done. Taking action. What we're really encouraging you all to do is think about, our homes, our buildings, our neighborhoods as a social ecosystem. And the different design ingredients we put into that social ecosystem are going to impact how people are going to behave. Obviously, people have preferences and backgrounds that also impact how they actually will behave in different environments. So it becomes kind of like a complex experiment to understand all of these things. Layering on top of that, our existing policies and kind of affordability concerns, it can be really hard to know if we're making the right decisions when we are designing housing. And a lot of the toolkit kind of focuses on ideas for new buildings. So we look at both market and non-market. But there's a lot of other areas of actions that we address in other parts of our work where we can actually help encourage social connections. So programming and partnerships and innovations, and then existing buildings. So a lot of our affordable and attainable housing in Canada already exists. We know that retaining these are really important because people form social connections over time. A lot of buildings that are older tend to have stronger social communities, not necessarily, but they do tend to have, people who have lived there for a long time and have strong ties to their neighborhood. And then thinking about, if we're looking at energy retrofits or other retrofits to existing buildings, are there opportunities to make them more social, either through, involving residents somehow in the upgrade process or creating extra social space or adding a community garden. We're kind of currently exploring this kind of retrofit phase with renewable cities. So stay tuned for more updates on what we find. And yeah, this last slide is really just about the fact that all of this work really was only possible with collaboration. And we've collaborated with public health officials, municipal planners, other local governments like First Nations, non-market and market developers, and landlords and operators and property managers, residents, architects, designers, and landscape architects, financial experts. So really, key to our work has been this idea that convening people from different areas is essential and important to actually make progress and kind of move towards more innovative housing. And yeah, our ultimate goal is really to make sociable design the standard, to make it, for any new building to say, we're going to think about social interaction and well-being as core to why we're designing housing. And that goes back to building the business case for why we need to do this, removing any barriers that are out there, whether they're policy or financial, and kind of advocacy and education. So even the awareness of being a good neighbor is actually really important. At a conference that I presented at a few months ago, a woman put up her hand. She said, I had lived in my condo for 15 years and I was really kind of embarrassed that I didn't know any of my neighbors. And so she was like, I made it my kind of goal that last year would be the year that she would start connecting with her neighbors. So she put up a poster, started a little social committee. And it sounded like it was going really well. So sometimes all it takes is like one person to decide to be the champion and kind of take the first step to building a stronger community in their home. yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So thank you so much for listening. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions.